Hello, welcome to the debate on Sky News. I'm Martin Stanford. Here's our take on developments brought together from America, the UK and around the world.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
This is both a shameless and a dangerous idea.
Have both Republican and Democrat presidential campaigns really lost their way? Plus, the war against Islamic State is now the time for debate, diplomacy and de-escalation. Name just one presidential candidate. Let me guess who you've chosen. Donald Trump? But is he the front runner for all the wrong reasons? In a moment, we'll be talking to the former presidential candidate, Dennis Kucinich. As usual, though, the Democrat commentator, Jeffrey Robinson, is standing by in New York, and the Conservative commentator, Armstrong Williams, is this week in Puerto Vallarta in Mexico. Jeffrey, the White House said yesterday that Donald Trump is not fit to be a candidate. Do you agree?
Well, listen, the White House would say that. I'm going to put myself in a very bizarre position. I'm actually going to defend my friend Donald, but under very, very narrow margins. The man I know is not a bigot, is not a racist, and is not a fascist, although fascism is a word that the Republicans are using now, rather liberally, to describe him. The man I know is a great showman, and he has now suddenly found himself threatened by Ted Cruz in Iowa. New Hampshire, he's way ahead of everybody. But in Iowa, there are two polls, one that puts Cruz ahead by 5, I think, and the other one that puts Donald ahead by 10 or 12. And he's nervous about Cruz. So what he needed to do was take the oxygen out of Cruz's campaign and do this Rambo thing that he does. And there was a time for Rambo. That's what he's doing. If you notice the clip you played, he read that statement. Now, Donald is always off the cuff, always firing from the hip, never uses a script. He did this time. And he did this time because he wanted to be very precise in what he said, that it would be a temporary measure. Is it illegal? Probably. Is it unconstitutional? Almost certainly. Is it practical? Could it be done? No. But that's not what Donald's all about. He's about firing up his base, who share these feelings, frankly. They share these feelings. He's taking votes away from the other clowns in the Republican Party and trying to suffocate Cruz. It's not about bigotry. It's about being a showman and using all his skills to shut Cruz up.
Let me bring in Armstrong now and ask you, Armstrong, does the ends justify the means? Is it okay for a candidate to say what the hell they want just to try to get ahead?
You know, I find it so shocking that Jeffrey would find a defense of Donald Trump, separating what he says versus what he reads as if they're two different people. If this were Dr. Ben Carson, anybody else, and the incredible things that Jeffrey has said about them, I can only imagine what he would be saying if it was somebody other than Donald Trump. It just goes to show you how Mr. Trump can manipulate not only people in the right and the mainstream media, how he can manipulate and intimidate people like Jeffrey to come out and make an excuse for him. How dare you make an excuse for someone who's trying to bring back an era in this country and in this world that we want to forget about that could ever exist? Listen, more Muslims are killed at the hand of these jihadists and terrorists than any other segment in the world. These comments should be condemned. There is no place for it. It's not who we are as Americans. Speaker of the House Paul Ryan was right. The leadership was right. This should be condemned. There is no place for it. And Jeffrey reminds us of what the problem is. They're intimidated by Trump, and they refuse to call him what he is.
Well, let's get the views of Dennis Kucinich, who's our special guest joining us now from Washington, D.C. Dennis, you've been a candidate. You've known the pressure to say something outstanding. Did Donald Trump go over the top?
Of course. When you're a candidate, you have a responsibility to be very careful with your rhetoric because it reverberates, in this case, around the world. It sends a message as to who not just you are as a person, but who America is, what America is. Our national anthem speaks of America being the land of the free, the home of the brave. We have values here that we celebrate every day. Whether we're always consistent with those values can be another debate, but it's what we aspire to. And so we have to be very careful when we go into political campaigns which would separate us from the core values of America. There is a lot of fear in America today, but we have to remember the essential message of America is bravery. We cannot translate that or transform it into fear.
It's interesting you say core values. I do understand your opinion on that, but what he says and the way he says it is proving incredibly popular if the polls are to be believed.
Well, it's popular because right now there is fear in America. There's a great deal of fear, and the fear has been happening and growing since 9/11. But we know that the United States has taken a series of policy measures that really have not been based on fact, and attack nations that we did not need to attack, and separate ourselves from the world community in a way that we did not need to do. We need a new direction in the world, and we have to realize that what we do abroad does have impact here. There's a blowback. So, you know, we take responsibility, need to do that, but those who run for president, would guide this country, have to be careful and establish, in an attempt to establish America as a nation among nations, not a nation above nations. And we have to do that out of strength, not fear, and we achieve peace through strength. Or strength through peace. And we're taking an approach here which is kind of bellicose, and that's dangerous.
Listen, I think Mr. Kucinich is absolutely correct. When you look at what happened in San Bernardino, California recently, you look at the Paris attacks, Americans live in fear, and they need someone to blame. They need a scapegoat. But this is why you have this thing you call leadership. Leadership does not define the enemy as Muslims or blacks or Jews. You define the enemy as who they are. They're Islamic extremists. They're not representative of Muslims and Islam. They're representative of a faction that we all need to work together in unison to destroy. To take a group of people who are suffer more of the repercussions of the destruction of this kind of behavior, this kind of mindset, and to make it seem as though that they all are the cause. It's just not leadership. It's not moral leadership. It's not character. In fact, in my mind, it's cowardice. You're taking advantage of the people because the people trust you to tell them the truth and to be honest and candid. And what you're doing is demonizing a whole group of people. And that's not who we are as Americans. That is not why that Statue of Liberty continues to stand in the harbor of New York. And we must repudiate and condemn Mr. Trump and not have people like Jeffrey and others in the media give him cover and make excuses for him.
Dennis Kucinich, what's the strategic call for the Democrats here? Do they join in with this level of rhetoric, or do they just laugh at it?
Well, there's nothing funny about rhetoric which is divisive. This country and the world needs healing right now. Do we have problems? Are there threats and terrorism? Absolutely. But they can be handled with the tremendous resources various nations have. What we don't want to do is to stir up fear and to cause people to be separate from core human values, where then stereotypical thinking takes over, where hate-based rhetoric begins to flourish. We've got to be very careful about that. We have to demand of everyone who would be in a position of leadership to rise to a level of higher responsibility for their statements and for their actions. And when we do that, hopefully we'll get better returns. But at this point, I want to say that the Constitution of the United States doesn't permit a religious test. It doesn't permit the United States to make decisions based on racial characteristics. We really have to start to remember who we are as a nation and continue to try to aspire to be that shining city on a hill, which was envisioned so many years ago by the people who founded this country.
Jeffrey, what do you recommend to the Democrat candidates, the leading candidate being Hillary Clinton right now? Does she even, well, she did dignify this by a riposte, but isn't there a danger in that?
No. No, what Hillary Clinton should do is keep playing the tape of Donald saying this. I mean, you have to understand, he's not a leader. He's running for the leadership, and he will be repudiated by the voters. He's not going to win. But then all the Republican clowns are doing this. Carson saying, we should never have a Muslim president, religious test. Rubio and Jeb Bush saying, yeah, the Syrians can come, but only Christian Syrians, not Muslim Syrians. They're all saying this kind of crap, but they're not leaders. They're not going to get elected. Hillary's doing exactly the right thing, saying, listen to Donald Trump. All the Republicans think that way. And Dennis is perfectly right. about the Constitution. This would never happen because it is unconstitutional. It couldn't possibly be enforced. I mean, it's all nonsense. But these are guys running for office, and they're saying what they say to try and eliminate the people who are competing with them to get the nomination. All is fair in love and politics, but they're not leaders. They're politicians.
The truth has taken a pummeling from all sides in this election. And if you're looking for truth, don't look for truth in a campaign season. We have to expect that our leaders, once they're in office, will be true with the people of our country. And so it's not, no one should get the vapors over the fact that a candidate is saying things that might be misleading. Inevitably, they have to be held accountable for their statements. And,
really, Dennis?
And hopefully voters
I mean, that's an incredible admission, isn't it? That the candidates are allowed to say almost what the hell they want, and yet they're expecting the American people to trust them once they get to the White House.
Well, you know, that's the paradox of our system. We have various fact checkers, and some candidates, when they make statements that prove to be untrue, they'll be awarded 3 or 4 Pinocchios. For the long nose, you lied. Well, the fact of the matter is that happens a lot, and the public doesn't necessarily know. This is where the media is important, because the media needs to keep putting out information that relates to facts. Right now, we're in a cycle of reaction. We are not necessarily even tethered to the truth at any given moment. We need to keep trying to find the underlying truth and also get to the core reasons why there's so much fear in America today. That's a much longer discussion than we have time for at this moment.
Let me bring in Armstrong on that very question of the media's responsibility to fact-check. Armstrong, the media in this, particularly the visual media, the television channels, are so partisan, they're not that bothered about fact-checking, are they?
You know, it's a much deeper issue, Martin. Donald Trump, in their mind, is a business. He's high ratings. He's high ad revenue, and there's a school of thought that they want to keep him in the race because he's just good for that business. But there comes a time where the integrity of these institutions that we call media must put aside what is financially beneficial for them and look at the truthfulness of what these candidates are saying and the harm that it causes where it reverberates around the world. I mean, anytime you have the leaders of France and other world leaders condemning Mr. Trump for what he's saying, that's an indication that it's no longer just an issue in America, but everybody is watching us. And as Mr. Kucinich said, we're still that shining hill on the city on the hill where people look to us for our core values, for our leadership, for our integrity, and our honesty. And yes, you can have this in the campaign season where politicians do what politicians do. But what we're seeing from Mr. Trump is a level that we have not seen. It's almost unprecedented in anything to compare it to that we've seen in recent American history. There's just nothing like it. And instead of the media being intimidated and fearful about it, they should do their jobs, make him accountable, make him, with the facts, the things that he says, even when he says he saw thousands of Muslims on 9/11 cheering here in America about the fact that those buildings were falling. And that was not the case. You've got to take him to task. You cannot be fearful. You got to do your job. And ultimately, it is the voters' decision to decide whether or not this is the kind of leadership that will move America forward, bring us together as a nation and as a world. And therefore, Mr. Trump continues to ramp it up. It's not as if he learns anything. It's astounding how he continues to ramp it up. And I say that is very frightening.
Armstrong, thank you for that. I just want to ask Dennis one more thing related to your time as a campaigner. Dennis, back in 2008, you mentioned as one of the things you talked about on the stump then was strengthening gun control. It's a sobering thought, isn't it, that in 2015-16, politicians are still talking about that?
Well, the easy access to assault weapons remains a major problem. And while the Supreme Court, since that time, has made a decision that has established our Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, as an individual right, we need to go a great distance to be able to promote responsible use of firearms in our society, and they're used increasingly against other people. That is a big problem, and what I'd like to say in conclusion, Martin, is that America needs to take a deeper look at the underlying violence in our society. Guns are one instrument of exercising people's violent tendencies, but there's other things, gang violence, racial violence, violence against gays, police community clashes. We need to look at the underlying symptoms of this and come up with a structured approach to dealing with it nationally.
Dennis Kucinich, pleasure for you to be with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
A reminder, you can catch up with Sky News Debate on Apple TV, Roku and Catch Up, and of course at skynews.com/US. It was the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, at a White House luncheon on June the 26th, 1954, who used the phrase, "To jaw is always better than to war." A good theory? Would it work today with religious extremism? Medea Benjamin is co-founder of the anti-war group Code Pink, Women for Peace. I believe you think we should talk a bit more.
Well, we certainly should stop the civil war in Syria so that we don't have that issue to contend with, and then work to isolate the Islamic State. And I think the nonviolent political solutions will do a much better job than we're doing now with all these nations piling in to bomb.
Very easy to say, if I may say so, to just sort the civil war out. They've been trying for 4 or 5 years. It hasn't really worked, has it?
No, but it's very easy to say that bombing is the answer. And now we're getting more and more into a dangerous phase when you have Russian planes being shot down and this tension now between NATO allies and Russia. And these new incidents are quite scary. I think that it's time to say that just more and more bombing is not going to solve the problem. There are talks that are going on in various countries right now. I think they do hold some promise. But if we put the kind of energy that we put into bombing, into the political solution to the civil war in Syria, I think we'd be a lot further than we are today.
War is always a failure of diplomacy. And once you get across that threshold, it's very hard to go back. I mean, Medea, I think her group is wonderful, and I think she's wonderful, but it would be helpful if she really understood the problem, which she clearly doesn't, because the bombing has nothing to do with the civil war in Syria. The bombing has to do with trying to cut off the financial arm of ISIL with the oil wells and stealing of oil and selling in the black market and whatnot.
Well,
the problem in Syria is very simply, you have to get rid of Assad. And once you do that, once you get rid of Assad, you can then free up the Sunni troops to put troops on the ground to go after ISIS. And it's a multifaceted approach. It's much more complicated than she's making it out to be.
Medea Benjamin?
Well, what you say is just not true. If you want to stop the flow of oil and the flow of weapons and the flow of recruits to Syria, the best thing you can do is really put the pressure on Turkey, which has been allowing these to go back and forth over the border. The U.S. is not putting all of its diplomatic clout to get the Turks to do that. And I think that there is a political solution to the civil war. In fact, if you look at history, it's almost always political solutions to war. And certainly in this case, it will be a transition from Assad through a political solution. And it's much better to do that sooner than later.
Do you not accept, Medea, that there's an argument which says let's try and get to a point where a political discourse is more likely to be effective?
I think that all sides have been saying that, and that's just what's getting this deeper and deeper. When you have the Russians going in to support Assad, we're not getting closer to being able to say, Assad is on the point of being defeated, now we can talk. I think we have to talk right now, and I think the Russians understand that we have to talk. I think it's unfortunate that our Congress and others are pushing Obama and our military to do what it doesn't want to do. It doesn't want to increase the U.S. military involvement. It wants to find a political solution.
Armstrong, is that case? Do you think the politicians are goading the president to do more than he wants to do?
You know, there's a lot of intelligence that the president has to decide. The last thing the president wants to do is engage, just like he's adamant on not putting troops on the ground against ISIS. Look, I think Mrs. Benjamin has a point. I think as long as we can negotiate and reasonable people can come to understandings and compromises, I think there are instances, whether it's what happened going in Iraq, going into Libya, and going into Syria, maybe not this chaos could have been avoided. But I think with ISIS, there are no negotiations. There's no reasonableness. You're not even talking to people who even share the common sense and the kind of values that we care about. These people want to destroy us. They see us as imbeciles. They see us as what's wrong with the world. And it's their mindset that the only thing that works is destruction and killing people who don't share their values. So I don't think there's any kind of communications that you can have with these people to bring them to the table. So we must do everything that we can to minimize their damage, minimize them from killing innocent people, and realize we got to destroy them as a world body to take them out before they do further destruction.
Medea Benjamin, Code Pink is about listening to or mobilising women's opinions as much as anything else. There are plenty of women up on Capitol Hill. How come they're not being heard?
Well, that's a good question. There is a Congresswoman, Tulsi Gabbard, a U.S. veteran, who has put in a very good bill saying that we have to stop being engaged in the civil war in Syria, and Congress should stop funding it. We wish that her voice were being heard more. We wish the voice of Barbara Lee, who was the only congressperson to ever get it right in the beginning, saying that we shouldn't go to war in Iraq after 9/11. And she has been putting bill after bill saying that military intervention is not the answer. Unfortunately, it is the guys with the guns all over the world that have their voices heard the most, or the loudest guys, because it's people like John McCain or it's people like Lindsey Graham who are now pushing for 10,000 troops to be sent into Syria. I think this is just utter madness. But as the president keeps getting this pressure, I'm afraid we're on the slippery slope to more troops.
Well, let's take up that point. Jeffrey, do you think women politicians are patronised and ignored?
In large part, yes. Medea is probably right. We live in a very chauvinistic society, and certainly Washington is a very chauvinistic town. The idea of Lindsey Graham and John McCain putting troops on the ground is beyond insanity. It is completely despicable. I mean, it's unthinkable. The American people will not stand for it in any case. And it's not what Obama wants to do. There doesn't seem to be much appetite for it in the rest of the Republican Party either. We need Sunni troops on the ground. You need a coalition, certainly with the Saudis and maybe even the Iranians, to come in and wipe out ISIL. Two different things, this business with Syria and Assad and ISIL. ISIL taking over large territories and declaring themselves a political state.
How would you talk to ISIL, Medea, to Daesh?
Well, first I said we need to solve the civil war problem first. And I think this bravado that we have to take out Assad, well, that sounds like let's take out Saddam Hussein, let's take out Muammar Gaddafi. Those worked really well. No, what we need is a transition. And that's what's got to happen. Then we isolate ISIL. We isolate ISIL by stopping new recruits from coming in. And I think some of the Europeans are starting to do some good work in their communities to stop young people from joining ISIL. I think we stop the flow of the oil, and that again goes back to putting pressure on Turkey, and we stop the flow of the weapons. We call for a total arms embargo in the region.
Okay, arms embargo, Armstrong, and blame the Turks. Would you agree with that?
I actually think that if we as a country, and Great Britain and the French, if we really wanted to destroy ISIS, we could. I think what is baffling is why no one has been able to topple them. They know where they're located. They've seen them on a satellite. Why they continue to thrive and wreak havoc on the world is baffling to me. I think one day when this administration has to make the decision that they're going to take them out, they can take them out. I think it's really frightening to understand why that has happened sooner instead of still happening later.
And why do you think there has been this indecision then, Jeffrey? You're shaking your head. Why?
Of course I am, because again, Armstrong understands as much of the problem as Medea does. The fact is, ISIL has integrated themselves into the civilian population in this territory. So you can't just take out ISIL because we don't know where they are. They're not wearing uniforms like a traditional army. This is a guerrilla army who is living amongst the people. So what do? You knock out an apartment building and kill 400 people as residual deaths to killing 4 leaders. They're trying to do the best they can with the drones and take out the leaders when they can locate them. And the bombing of the oil tankers and the oil fields is the way to stop them by cutting off their cash flow and reinvestment. It's all well and good what Medea says, and I'm sure her solution will work when Peter Pan becomes president. But until then, it's a multifaceted take out Assad at the same time, put the Sunni troops on the ground, continue the bombing, and maybe then you stand a chance of destroying ISIL.
Medea, Jeffrey's point seems to be in this, and I know you've faced a similar criticism in other campaigns you've fought, that it's naive, it's oversimplistic, your approach.
Well, naive is the approach that more bombing is going to be the solution. If that were true, then why for the last 14 years have extremist groups grown, whether it's Al-Qaeda or the Taliban in Afghanistan or now ISIS, and who knows what the next iteration will be. The bombing has not gotten us anywhere. So I think it's the naivety is coming from the hawks who say, let's keep doing more of the same, that has only made the situation worse. We need to have political talks and isolate ISIS, and I agree, the local people have to be the ones that are going to make the change. But that means let's get ourselves out of this, not get ourselves deeper into it.
Armstrong, let me put the point to you about negotiations with other leaders and so on. Can that really be effective?
Well, it has been effective, but I do think Jeffrey makes a very good point about we don't know who ISIS is. But there's one thing that we do know, Jeffrey, whether it's San Bernardino, California, Paris, France, the law enforcement seems to know immediately who these terrorists are, that they've been tracking them, and they've had cause for concern. I think the issue is, how do we find a way to eliminate, stop them cold in their tracks before they bring about this havoc and destruction? I think that's a debate that we need to have, because tracking them and not being able to do anything until they commit these crimes against humanity is one thing. We got to find a way around it to stop them before they can succeed in what they're trying to do.
Armstrong, Jeffrey, thank you both very much indeed for being with us this week. And that's it for this edition of The Debate. You can continue watching Sky News on Apple TV, on Roku and Catch Up, and of course on skynews.com. Until next time, goodbye.